Hello and welcome to ThePrint. This is Akanksha Mishra. And today we are going to be discussing the world's first pollution market that was pioneered in Surat in Gujarat state. And this pollution control experiment has just been shortlisted as a finalist for the Earthshot Award, which is a very prestigious prize which is awarded for innovative solutions that tackle our planet's biggest challenges. And this pollution market experiment in Surat was conducted by the research center JPAL South Asia along with the University of Chicago's Energy Policy Initiative in India. But what is a pollution market? How does it work? Is it the new breakthrough solution to deal with air pollution in industries? To answer these questions and discuss more about this process, we have with us Tithi Mukhopadhyay, the Deputy Executive Director of JPAL South Asia. Welcome, Tithi. Thank you for being with us.
My pleasure, Akanksha.
And I think let me just start off by first congratulating you on being an Earthshot Prize finalist. And let's begin with some basics. So can you walk us through the process of what is a pollution market, or officially it's called the emissions trading scheme? What is it that you designed in Surat in the most simplest terms?
Let's see. Doing that in the most simplest terms is a little bit challenging, but I'm going to try very hard. So basically, the emissions trading scheme or the market is a cap and trade for particulate matter. So if we get into the mechanics of Surat, I think you'll be able to see what that means in steps. So in Surat, the emissions trading scheme, the regulator, which is the pollution regulator, sets a total pollution cap. Permits to pollute are defined and allocated to industries on the basis of their polluting potential. So think of this as boiler size. If the industry pollutes more than the allocated permits, they have to purchase more permits. So very clearly applicable to how capital and other kinds of things that are very prevalent in industries to be able to buy things if you've run out of certain things. So they have to purchase more permits, whereas if they emit less, industries can sell these permits to earn money. So as you can imagine how cost incentives would work in this. So what this does is it creates an incentive to reduce pollution at the lowest cost. This sort of contrasts with the existing regulation, which is built on the command and control methods. Those are enforced by deep, steep penalties, and such rules are relatively inflexible and consequently can impose high cost on industries. And if you impose high cost on industries, that comes at a cost of economic growth. So under an emissions trading scheme, the overall amount of pollution allowed from regulated industries is strictly capped. However, the firms can decide for themselves how to allocate the total allowed emissions amongst themselves by buying or selling these pollution permits. Firms for whom it's cheap to cut pollution have an incentive to make large reductions because this leaves them with excess permits that can be sold to other market participants. Meanwhile, for firms that find it expensive to cut their emissions can choose to buy permits from others. At the end, the total number of permits still remains the same because that is the cap on pollution. And because this remains constant, the emission trading scheme works as a mechanism of sort of redistributing the pollution reduction to achieve the desired aggregate outcome, but still at the minimum possible cost for the regulated entities. So this is what ETS or emissions trading scheme or a market is in its simplest form.
Wow, that actually explained it quite well. So, if I understand it, it's kind of like a carbon credit market, but specifically for air pollution.
Yes, yes.
And
But instead of credit, it's permits that are being traded. And
yeah,
firms can plan, the regulator can sit. So it's sort of I would say it's a constrained optimization setup wherein your max is provided and then different entities can decide to come together to reach that max.
now, let's talk a little bit about the study itself, the experiment that was conducted in Surat, which I'm sure our audiences also know is very famous for, being an industrial hub. There's a lot of industries there, so I can understand why you chose that place to conduct it. But How did you conduct this experiment? How, what were the incentives that you gave to the industries themselves to participate in it? And most importantly, what were the results like? So, how effective was the emissions trading scheme in Surat?
So I always like saying this, that the ETS work that we've done in Surat is sort of the labor of rigor and collaboration. So ETS, I think I just want to go back to the first point that you were making, Akanksha. ETS is actually not new. So emissions trading scheme has been implemented in the European Union to address carbon emissions as well as to reduce carbon, sulfur dioxide, and nitrogen oxide in the US. However, it was not clear whether that could work in emerging economies where the regulatory capacity is limited, right? And to test this particular idea, the Gujarat Pollution Control Board, along with the researchers that are affiliated with JPAL and EPIC, ran a randomized control trial. Now, that's basically what the study is. So this randomized control trial, involved 298 firms in Surat. Surat, as you rightly pointed out, is an industrial city where the majority of the polluting firms were a part of the textile industry. Now, just to put it into context, around 30% of these firms, of these 298 firms, were polluting more than the national standard. The average level of fine particulate matter in the air near the plants was anywhere between 10 to 20 times higher than WHO's recommended maximum concentration. So to begin at a place like that, I think it was a very, very urgent need. And because of, I would say GPCB, bringing this entire ecosystem together, this randomized control trial entailed what we call a phased-in approach, where the firms were divided into two statistically comparable groups, right? Which means that they were randomly allocated. There's a little bit of the RCT terminology. They were randomly allocated to different groups, but statistically they were absolutely similar. And one group found sort of themselves in the status quo, the current regime that it was running, and the other group actually received the ETS scheme. And this, sort of like what we did is we studied the emissions continuously from these SEMS devices, which are real-time sensors that give you real-time data to try and measure the emissions. And what the results showed us that the participating firms in the ETS group reduce their particulate emissions by 20 to 30% while staying within the limit at all points in time. Compliance was nearly 100%, which means like compliance is a very, very big factor in a lot of the emission schemes, emission tools. But this somehow saw a very, very, I would say near 100% compliance, and it cut pollution by 20-30%, like I mentioned. And in terms of abatement costs, it actually did not make any difference to the abatement costs, which one would think that bringing down pollution by 20 to 30% is also going to require significant amount of costs, but that was not the case. And also that SEMS devices were installed on some of these firms for the chimneys of these firms. The system overall had real-time data, which made enforcement very credible. So I think all of these things like really added to the value of how ETS works and what can be replicated and where it goes. Yeah.
So the way I understand it, it first of all reduced emissions. It also increased compliance, which means that firms were themselves willing to comply to it, and it had no change in the firms' costs themselves. So I think one of the issues that comes up
Regulation costs as well. So no changes in the regulation costs
for
for
the
abatement.
regulation for either the regulators or for the industries, it did not have a change in their costs, which means they, I'm sure, must be willing to comply with it. And we obviously saw better results for the environment. That sounds like quite a successful study. And this brings me to my next question, which is that the success of the Surat model isn't just good news for pollution control. It's also good news for this particular brand of market-based solutions for air pollution and other environmental problems. Can you tell me a little bit about, as you were mentioning, it has been tried and tested in the US and other European countries, but why is it so significant in the global south? What is the significance of the success of the Surat model over here?
So I think that's a fantastic question. So I think while this has been tested in other contexts, it hasn't been tested for particulate emissions. So the Surat emissions trading scheme is the world's first trading scheme for particulate emissions. Like you mentioned, emissions markets have been, a popular regulatory tool amongst, I would say, the global north countries, but particularly for sulfur dioxide and carbon dioxide. And somehow those markets have not seen I would say a prevalent use in the emerging economies. Just to quote a few figures, 49 out of the top 50 countries with the most polluted air are located in the global south. And these economies are also the ones that find themselves in a position where economic growth is an absolute priority, right? Which sort of implies that industries will find a need for flexible and effective pollution regulation, because both clean air and economic growth are going to have to be pursued together, unlike the other economies of Europe and US, right? So I think what is great about the Surat evidence is that it marks an important milestone. It shows that pollution can be reduced in a cost-effective manner without being inflexible and expensive for capital equipment, regulation mandates, but also in a way not just say, reduce pollutions, keep the cost same, but also find itself in a position where health benefits exceed the cost by over 25 times. So I think overall it's sort of for the economies where this, I would say, this twin goal of cleaner air and economic growth have to be pursued, this seems like something that can work.
That's great. Now, I think let's move on to some of the challenges that you faced in the Surat experiment itself, but also now, if you were to expand it to other states in India or even other countries, what are some challenges that you expect to face there?
So I think, like I said right at the beginning, ETS for us is a labor of rigor and collaboration. It's taken more than a decade for all of this to sort of happen, come together, pieces coming together, I would say, allied parties coming together. It required a multi-year government, researcher, implementing partners, data partners, collaboration, standard setting by, centralized pollution control bodies, industry training, a lot of amount of capacity building and workshopping that, at times does not get spoken about, but it's a massive investment, and I'll talk about it in a bit, as well as iterating on the market design, right? If you think about this and compare it to, say, for example, any product being launched in, the R&D and the iterative process, this is pretty much sort of similar, where the R&D and figuring out what is going to work best for the industries, what is going to work best for the small firms, the larger firms, how do you think about data systems, how do you bring the ecosystem together? I think it took like a, sort of a massive effort of the entire ecosystem coming together to solve a problem which was, I think, has always been far beyond just one agency, right? It's like a multi-agency effort. So I think instead of challenges, I think what I would frame it as, Akanksha, is what are the things that need to get replicated? And you'll see why they would be pretty much challenges, is what are the things that need to be replicated to make sure a Surat result set can be achieved in any other state or any new country. And I'll try to talk about a few things which I don't think get talked about a lot. I think the first thing is data infrastructure and analytics. Because the regulatory framework and the regulation tool is so dependent on real-time data and the volume of data that is coming in from industry. So you literally, because it's real-time data, it is almost like to the minute, to the hour, you will know what the emissions have been like. And because this data infrastructure, therefore, it's just like, it's not that it's just a big dump of data. You also need the right kind of standards and protocols to be able to analyze that data, to set the right kind of standards, to have the analytical tools, to have platforms to look at that data, make sense of it, credibly enforce the standards and guidelines that are being set by the pollution control boards, to be actually able to take data and make it into decisions. So I think a lot goes into that, and I think that's one big place where the researchers were extremely instrumental in terms of thinking about some of these analysis and how do you think about the modeling associated with it, simulation, so on and so forth. So it was a massive data endeavor. And given that typically, in my experience, not just in energy, environment, and climate change, in other sectors also becomes very difficult to replicate. I think that requires a very clear focus. The second thing I would say is institutional capacity that will uphold these guidelines and standards and norms that are being set by the central pollution control agencies. And to be able to do that, again, going back to the main challenge that we had with command and control models, if there is limited capacity for regulation, then how do we make sure that institutional capacity is being built up to be able to support these things? So, thinking about the entire partner ecosystem, analytics, enforcement cadence, I think Gujarat did a fantastic job of bringing in that expertise, technical staff, investing in capacity building of the industries, of the regulators, bringing in all allied partners to be able to sort of make sure that this is something that was on the top of everyone's mind, but everyone knew how to work within the system. So I think that itself is great. And I think the third one, which I would say it's already a part of our plans, so I don't think it's going to be as much of a challenge. It's more about the foresight and moving without any blind spots, is understanding the stakeholder map, right? So in Surat, with GPCB anchoring this massive endeavor, we got to know the ecosystem really well. We are now moving into other states. Our learning is going to be different in terms of, is the ecosystem matured enough? Are there partners that we are going to be able to bank on beyond the government? The same thing goes for other countries as well. There could be some countries in which it's easier to form that ecosystem, that winning coalition that's going to get you across that hurdle line. So I think those would be the three areas, which I wouldn't say challenges, but I would say those would be very crucial for this to be replicated.
That was very well put. Thank you so much, Tithi. Now, the next thing that I think is on everybody's mind is what is next for the team that built ETS? Because obviously with the success of Surat, it's not going to stop here. It's going to expand. That's the point of something like, as revolutionary as the ETS. So what are the countries and what are the markets are you expanding into? Is it going to remain, relegated to the particulate matter pollution, or are you going to also expand into other kinds of pollution markets?
So yeah, it is a very exciting time for the team. In fact, we've recently launched a joint initiative, which is called the Emissions Market Accelerator. It is a joint initiative between JPAL and EPIC, and it has been brought together by these organizations to make sure that other Indian states and emerging economy governments can design, implement similar markets, building on the Surat evidence and experience. And building on the Gujarat momentum at this point in time, the EMA team, as we call it, is now supporting a sulfur dioxide or a SOx market in Maharashtra, and we are also beginning to design a market in Rajasthan. There are also quite a few discussions underway to expand to several other Indian states as well as internationally. So right now we are just like taking it one step at a time, but yeah, this has already been set up. So
that's great. Now, just the final question, which I think will also give you an opportunity to comment on being a finalist for the Earthshot Prize. What message do you think, the Earthshot Prize and being selected for it? What message does it send about new age technology and, as I mentioned before, market-based solutions for global problems? What does it tell us about how environmental challenges are going to be dealt with in the future?
Oh, that's a very heavy question, but I'll try to simplify my response. I think when I heard that we had been nominated, and actually TPC we had been nominated, I think what made it very very while all of us have been working on this for like almost more than a decade now, I think what became very real and true to all of us is that an evidence-based regulatory tool with rigorous measurement and market incentive is not just a global north reality. When we started up, all of the research associated with this back in the day, it was something that was only happening in the global north. But what this also signals, and I think that is more for an organization like JPAL, it actually signals a shift. The future of climate action lies in the pragmatic, evidence-based, and collaborative innovations, right? It's always been our aim to bring together technological tools, market mechanisms, behavioral incentives to achieve the kind of impact that we've achieved at scale. And I think, again, like I said, I would be extremely remiss if I don't put this through that, this could not have been possible without the continued support from the government of Gujarat. They have been just absolutely fantastic. Shri Devang Thakur and the entire team. I think it has been fantastic to see how the government could come to the forefront of thinking about this innovation, bringing the ecosystem together and making sure, that acceleration of a market of this kind was successful in achieving emissions reduction. So.
That's perfect. Thank you so much for this, Tithi. I think thank you firstly for introducing us to such a novel experiment. And I'm sure in the future we'll get to see more such experiments being carried out and hopefully being successful in other parts of India. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us at ThePrint.
It was my pleasure.